Chapter 9 of Brother I'm Dying by Edwige Danticat. One Papa Happy, One Papa Sad. In 1980, 4 long years after my parents' visit, the American Consulate wrote to my uncle requesting that Bob and I take a physical to see if we were in good enough health to travel to the United States. I was 11 years old. Usually a physical was the last step in approving an application, so everyone began to speak to me as though I were already gone. In New York, Tante Denise said, you'll have to be good and help your mother. In New York, Marie Micheline said, you must write me every week so you can keep up your French. In New York, Nick said, be sure to buy me a nice watch. In New York, Liline said, be sure to find me a gold necklace. I agreed to everything, of course. When I get to New York, I thought, I'll have to become a slave to fulfill all the promises I've made. Between us and New York, however, stood a list of consulate-approved doctors and the extensive examination they were required to perform. My uncle chose a doctor whose clinic had the feel of a transitional middle world between our parents and ours. On the walls of his examining room were hygiene posters in Creole, French, and Spanish, and diplomas and certificates from both Haitian and American universities. The doctor was short and barrel-chested, with skin the same color as his curly black hair, which he wore parted on one side. As he pushed my head back and pried open my mouth, he spoke to me in French, then repeated himself in English. Parce qu'il faudra bientôt apprendre l'anglais, he said, because you'll soon have to learn English. While Bob and my uncle looked on, he made me push out my tongue, palpitated my neck for swollen glands, listened to my heart and lungs with his stethoscope, then hit my knees with a small hammer, making my legs rise involuntarily. After he'd done the same to Bob, he wrote out a referral for chest x-rays to be taken at the public hospital down the street. The small windowless waiting room in the public hospital's radiography department was filled with many more patients than it could hold comfortably. More were already interned in the hospital and were lying on gurneys in the narrow hallway. Others were sitting on the few available chairs or on the chipped cement floor, their fractured limbs wrapped in homemade bandages and slings. Others tried to cough discreetly, even as they held their chests and hid the bright red spots they'd spat into their handkerchiefs, a sure sign of tuberculosis. When my turn came, I followed the attendant into a dark room with the giant machine. My uncle and Bob were told to wait outside, leaving me in the dark with the stranger. The spark was like a flash of lightning. The attendant came round again, this time putting me in profile. My uncle and I waited in the hallway as Bob had his turn. Pacing back and forth, my uncle kept his head down and both his hands in his pockets. Since his surgery, hospitals made him extremely nervous. A few days later, the doctor sent word for us to return to his office. When we entered the examining room, he was wearing a white surgical mask. The x-rays have returned, he said, looking only at my uncle. His voice was slightly distorted by the mask, so he raised it slightly to make sure my uncle heard him. There's a problem. He knew that Uncle Joseph couldn't speak and did not expect a reply. These children, he said, glancing momentarily at Bob and me, appear to have tuberculosis. My uncle raised both his eyebrows to display shock. I too was surprised. After all, we didn't have a cough that made us spit up blood. Would we now have to be quarantined, be sent to the sanatorium? One of Liline's cousins, who was named Melina after Grandma Melina, had gotten full-blown tuberculosis at 16. She had visited Liline now and then, and I'd watched as she'd regularly stop whatever she was doing to double over and cough. She was eventually sent to the sanatorium and died a few weeks after her 17th birthday. Sleeping on the top bunk above Liline and her, those few times she'd spent the night, I probably caught the tuberculosis from her and passed it on to my brother. Or maybe Bob had caught it from a kid at school, a kid who didn't even know he had it, and had passed it on to me. Fortunately, their tuberculosis is not active, the doctor said, but we have to treat them immediately to be sure it stays that way. The treatment will last 6 months. Does that mean I'm not going to die? I wanted to ask. My uncle's mouth narrowed into a small O. 6 months of treatment meant 6 more months in Haiti. That would mean 6 more months with our uncle and aunt and our cousin and friends, but also 6 more months away from our parents and brothers. Just then, Sitting in the doctor's old and prickly wicker chair, I was not concerned about any of that. I simply didn't want to have tuberculosis, and I certainly did not want to die. I would think back to this moment when, early in my father's illness, after a week-long hospitalization following an emergency room visit for shortness of breath, he was quarantined at Coney Island Hospital because his skin test was positive. The doctors had not yet eliminated the possibility of tuberculosis, and all of the hospital workers, along with my father's visitors, were ordered to wear surgical masks before they approached his bed in an isolated section of the ward. Perhaps recalling the horrors of tuberculosis, it was once as deadly as AIDS during the virus's early years. The specter of mortality it posed, and the fact that in Bel Air, the word poitrine or TB carrier had often been hurled as an insult. When he was quarantined at Coney Island Hospital, my father asked my brother Carl to tell the doctors that a lot of Haitians test positive on the skin test, even though they don't actually have active tuberculosis. "I don't have this disease," he insisted. "Tell them." "We don't have this disease," I wanted to scream that day as the doctor gave us, rather gave my uncle, our directives. "Even though they're not infectious, we can't be too careful," the doctor said. "They must now use their own utensils, no sharing with others." Since we all shared meals and utensils at home, this would be a constant reminder both to us and everyone else that our bodies were hosting a potentially deadly contagion. "They have to follow the treatment closely," the doctor continued. "They must take the pills every day or the virus will get stronger and will move to other parts of their bodies. Unless their x-rays read differently in 6 months, they won't be able to travel." He wrote 2 prescriptions, which he handed to my uncle. "Don't forget," he told us, looking into our faces at last, "every morning when you take your pills, you're closer to New York." My uncle stopped by the pharmacy on Grand Rue, where his youngest sister Tante Z had a stationery stand. Surrounded by mounds of pens and notebooks, Tante Z jumped out of her chair and instantly scooped Bob up in her arms. Of my father's sisters, Tante Z was the most playful. Short and plump, and at her roundest looking and feeling like a feather pillow, she liked to pull Bob and me into her arms whenever she saw us and bury her face in our necks, tickling us with the tip of her nose. She and Bob were caught in just such an embrace when I blurted out, "You can't do that anymore." "Why not?" She released Bob, handing him a brand new pen and notebook to scribble in as he sat on the footstool in front of her. "Because we have TB," I said. She seemed stunned, looking up at my uncle for confirmation. My uncle shrugged, then slapped one hand on the top of the other, as if to say, "What are you going to do?" As if to answer, Tante Z motioned for me to come to her, and just as she always did, wrapped her arms around my neck and sweetly buried her nose in my neck. From that day on, every morning before school, even as other children walked by and stared, my uncle would line Bob, Nick, and me up on the front gallery, and as Tante Denise held our ceramic cups of water, our own, which we were not allowed to share with anyone else, handed us the aspirin-like pills that were meant to cure us. Nick, it turned out, also failed his precautionary x-rays and had to be treated along with us. Liline, however, had tested negative. Once the pill was in our mouths, my uncle would hand us each a large spoonful of cod liver oil, which we were to swallow before Tante Denise would surrender the water. Perhaps fearing that we might gag, Tante Denise would always cry out, "Fais vite, fais vite," urging us to hurry up and wash the pills down before she took the cups back. During our treatment, Bob developed a palm-sized rash on his back that alternately bled and scabbed over. At first, the doctor, whom during our monthly checkups I began to think of as Dr. TB, told us that Bob's rash was unrelated to his medication, but then I developed an even larger lesion on my right buttock, and he was forced to admit some connection. Nick, on the other hand, completely lost his appetite, dropped 8 pounds, and constantly complained of cold feet. Thankfully, the rashes, coldness, and loss of appetite went away when our treatment ended 6 months later. After another series of x-rays, Dr. TB gave Bob and me our medical clearance to travel to the United States. But a new problem emerged. During the 6 months that we were being treated, my father was laid off from the glass factory where he was working, and because both my parents and Kelly and Carl were now surviving on my mother's modest income as a textile factory worker, Our application was placed on hold until my father could prove that he and my mother had enough income to provide for all of us. Just when my uncle needed them the most, my father stopped writing us letters around this time. In his final note, he proposed that we try the now much cheaper call centers run by Teleco, the national telephone company. As we waited for Papa to find another job, every Sunday afternoon, my Uncle Bob and I would walk to a calling center near the fabric shop where my uncle worked, and the three of us would squeeze into a narrow telephone booth with cardboard-thin walls and try to talk with my parents. The conversations were always the same. My uncle would scribble a few notes on a small notepad he kept in his shirt pocket. Instant letters that in a few sentences updated our parents on the state of our health, our schoolwork, our grades, and the latest on our immigration application. I would carefully repeat my uncle's scrawled phrases, watching his lips for modification as I went on. It was hot and cramped with the three of us in there, and every once in a while, my uncle would have to change places with us on the narrow bench as we passed the phone around. My parents would interrupt me now and then to make a comment or ask a question, and I'd have to stop and wait for my uncle to respond before speaking again. The remaining time was for our parents to speak directly to us. "Now tell me how you are," my mother would ask. "Bien," I'd answer, "fine." On another extension, my father asked, "You're being a good girl, aren't you?" "Oui, papa," I'd answer, feeling that I had already spoken to them enough, using my uncle's words. "I found a job," my father announced one Sunday afternoon. "Bravo," my uncle wrote. "Bravo," I repeated. I could almost imagine the look on my father's face, a broad smile that showed how proud he too was of himself. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at the house in Bel Air announcing that we had an appointment at the American Consulate in a few days. At the center of so many families' lives, the focus of so many thoughts and prayers, Le Consul, in the flesh, was just a very tan, nearly bronzed white man with what seemed like bottle green eyes. Was he the consul himself, or just one of the many employees that formed the pastiche of that identity? I didn't know then and don't know now. However, the man we appeared before that day was wearing a thin white shirt with no undershirt. His fingernails were brownish red with what looked like terracotta underneath. As I sat with my brother and uncle separated from the green-eyed man by a polished wooden desk, he looked through our papers, a thick file accumulated over the last 5 years, the blood tests to prove that my father's paternity, the TB diagnosis and treatments, even the x-rays of our lungs, both before and after treatment, and later I would learn character references from my parents' friends, employers, and pastor, my parents' pay stubs, bank statements, tax returns, a summary version of who they had to be in order to be allowed to live in the same country as all their children. Ta maman, ton papa, te manque? Do you miss your mother and father? The man leaned across the desk to ask me, then my brother. Hanging on the wall behind him was a large American flag, the stars literally bursting from the corner square, their spiky edges merging into the wall. Sensing that it was the right thing to do, we both nodded as if bowing to the flag that our grandfather had once fought against, that our mother and father had now embraced for nearly 10 years, that we were about to make our own. As my head bobbed up and down, I felt my old life quickly slipping away. I was surrendering myself not just to a country and a flag, but to a family I'd never really been part of. "I'm going to make you very happy." The man picked up a stamp and dangled it in the air in front of us before lowering it on top of the top sheet in each of our files. "You're both approved," he said in what must have been the official sing-song. "You're now free to be with your parents, for better or for worse." "Pour le meilleur et pour le pire," he said. Why? I wondered if he knew something we didn't. Besides, what could be worse than waiting most of our lives to spend 5 minutes with a person who would say something like that? That evening, we returned to the call center to share the news with my parents. My uncle furiously scribbled things down, detailing tasks that needed to be performed before we could leave. "We have to buy the plane tickets," I said, deciphering his words. "Tell your uncle to buy them. I'll send him the money." My father spoke louder than he needed to, his voice energetic, animated. "Are you happy?" my father asked me toward the end of the conversation. I pretended not to hear. "Here's Bob," I said. My brother, too, came to life on the phone with my parents. The three of them were already chatting like old friends, plotting all the things that they were going to do. "Edwige has promised a bunch of gifts, something for everyone," he tattled. I reached over and pinched him on the back of the hand that was holding the phone. My uncle slapped my hand away, all the while shooting me a reprimanding glare. Even though we had been expecting it, how could I tell him that I didn't want to leave him? What difference could it make? For better or for worse, I had to go. These are my parents, my real parents, and they wanted me to come and live with them. Later that week, Tante Denise took me to a pricey shop on Grand Rue to buy me a new dress. I picked one I thought rather fancy. It was bright yellow with a satin camisole and a flounced skirt. Bob's light blue suit was made by my uncle's tailor, whom he'd engaged since he'd stopped taking work to Monsieur Pardel. On our departure day, we were overfed before being taken to the airport. Tante Denise cooked a large pot of cornmeal and herring and blended beet juice with condensed milk for us to wash it down. When Nick, sobbing in his cornmeal, asked, "Why do I have to go back to school after my lunch? Why can't I go with them?" Tante Denise wrapped her arms around Bob's and my necks, kissed our cheeks from behind our chairs, and ran into her room. Liline's father, Tante Denise's brother Lenoir, who'd spent 3 years working as a cane cutter in the Dominican Republic, had recently come home to die. That grief, compounded by our leaving, was too much for her to bear. Liline, however, was taking things a lot better. She barely knew her father and was terrified of the sunken eyes, dried-up skin, and convulsions through which his illness was manifesting itself. Just as Tante Denise locked her bedroom door, Liline had blocked the door to her heart. She went to see her father only once and swore she would never see him again. And as Bob and I left the house, even though I'd left my treasured copy of Madeline tucked under her pillow, which I knew she had seen that morning while making her bed, she simply said to us, "Now we. See you later," while never looking up from her plate. At the airport, Bob and I tried to keep up with my uncle as he hurried to one of the long lines winding their way to the counters. My uncle was holding our single small suitcase in one hand and a mustard-colored envelope filled with our papers in the other. Waiting on the line, my uncle began sweating and kept wiping his face with his blue monogrammed handkerchief. Was soaked. Was he sad, angry, nervous, for himself, for us? Over the years, in my travels, I have spoken to 3 middle-aged Haitian flight attendants who claimed they were the ones who met my brother and me at the airline counter, took our hands, and led us away from my uncle, guiding us to our seats on the airplane. "You didn't cry at all," one of them said. "You both simply gave your uncle a kiss on the cheek and walked away." "You didn't make any noise about it," another one said, "but the front of your dress was wet from your tears." "You refused to move. Your uncle had to order you to come with me, and he got really mad and yelled," the last one said, not knowing that by then my uncle could not yell. Their faulty recollections have wiped out whatever certainty I've had, if ever, about that day. At different stages, my brother and I were probably all of those children, the ones who didn't cry, the ones who quietly sobbed, and the ones who refused to leave. Over the years, I have also met other passengers who believed they saw my brother and me, him in his pale blue suit, me in my lemon-colored dress, tightly gripping each other's hands and pushing our heads back into the seats as the plane took off. I only remember wishing, as we soared into the clouds, that my uncle had cried a torrent of tears, had thrown himself on the ground, and made a scene, all the while forbidding us to go. He should have blurted out, in his old voice, the sudden revelation that I was really his daughter and that he couldn't live without me. Sitting in a middle seat next to my brother, who had insisted on the window I had really wanted, I had looked out at the white clouds only once, when suddenly it occurred to me that since my uncle couldn't speak on the phone and probably wouldn't write letters to us as children, we would likely never be in touch again. This realization was distressing enough to make me want to close my eyes forever. I encouraged my brother to do the same, In the process, we fell asleep, waking up only when one of the flight attendants nudged us to rouse for supper. By then it was too dark to see the clouds again. Bob marveled at the fact that it didn't seem as though we were moving. Though we'd eaten what was probably the biggest lunch of our lives, we still cleaned up our tray of plain food, relishing the novelty of the tiny plastic plates on which the Haitian-style rice and beans and American-style grilled chicken breasts were served. After having spread one of his small butter squares on his roll, Bob placed the other one in his pocket, where it melted before landing. We heard our parents before we saw them, walking on either side of the stewardess who'd taken us from my uncle at the airport in Port-au-Prince. My brother and I made our names above the din of the people lunging forward, flashing pictures, waving flowers and stuffed animals in the arrival lounge. Our parents' voices, my father's firm and resolute, my mother's brassy and booming, were coming from behind us. The stewardess loosened her grip on our hands, but didn't completely let go as we turned around to find them. "Are these your parents?" she asked as they approached, my mother sweeping the crowd aside and my father following more leisurely behind her, apologizing to the shoving victims in her wake. When she reached us, my mother grabbed us both and pressed us against her chest. I inhaled deeply, taking in her mixed scent of coconut, hair pomade, and baby powder that formed uneven white lines all around her neck. My father took care of the logistics, signing a form that the stewardess had until then kept folded in her pocket. "Bonne chance," good luck, she said before walking away. My father bent down for us to kiss him. His beard, thicker and bristlier now, prickled my lips and nose. Still, I followed my brother's lead and wrapped my arms around his neck as I kissed him. "Where are Kelly and Carl?" asked my brother, already displaying the male sibling solidarity I would later come to suspect all my brothers of. A friend from their building was looking after the boys, my mother said. We'd see them when we got home. In the airport parking lot, I shivered. Even though it was spring, a concept I'd have to grow accustomed to now, the actual manifestation of seasons, there was a biting chill in the air. Later I'd learned that my father had lost a job that day. He'd asked his boss at the New Jersey handbag factory where he was working if he could leave early to pick us up, and the boss said no. My father had left anyway, and on his way out, he was told he was fired. During the drive to the airport, he decided he would never work for anybody again. While loading our suitcase into the back of an old, beaten-up gray station wagon, my father asked, "How's Uncle?" "Uncle seems sad," Bob answered for me. "I think he was sad to see us leave." "I suppose that's how it is sometimes," my father said in a whisper of a voice. "One papa happy, one papa sad."